I had the opportunity to go home to Goldsboro, the eastern part of the state, for Thanksgiving. I have not had the opportunity to spend Thanksgiving with my family for years, so that was really wonderful. And I trust that each of you, I know we had a wonderful feast here. I saw pictures, and I trust that each of you had a great Thanksgiving, and maybe you're still enjoying some good old-fashioned leftovers. There's a story that I shared a few weeks ago in my class that relates to this, about a woman who invited her family and friends to come over for Thanksgiving lunch. And at the table, she turned to her 6-year-old daughter and said, "Would you like to say the blessing?" And her 6-year-old daughter replied, "Well, I wouldn't know what to say, Mommy." And her mother said, "Well, just say what you hear Mother say." The little girl bowed her head and said, "Dear Lord, why on earth did I invite all these people to dinner?" Hopefully that wasn't your experience, but I trust that we are still in the spirit of Thanksgiving, and it's wonderful to have this holiday, and yet ideally we are in the spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving every minute of every day. And I also think it's interesting that our two major holidays in the United States, Thanksgiving and Christmas, are both focused around gratitude, giving, and receiving. It's a powerful time of year. And the space in between Christmas and Thanksgiving is also significant in certain cultures and in certain religious traditions. In the Christian tradition, the space between Thanksgiving and Christmas is called Advent. Traditionally, Advent is a time of expectancy or preparation for the Christ, the coming of the Christ. The Latin root for the word Advent is aventus, which means coming. And so it's about that sense of expectation. Advent has been celebrated since the 400s CE in the Common Era. And today is the first day of Advent. We lit the candle for hope. We celebrate Advent around hope, peace, love, and joy, and seeing what they represent in our life. In Unity, we tend to look at these things in a metaphysical, meta meaning beyond the physical, beyond the literal, but we look at these things in a holistic way. How would they apply as a spiritual truth across any tradition, any history, any time? And so when we look at Advent that way, it's a time for increasing our capacity to experience what we call the Christ, or the divine presence within each and every one of us. Christ was not a person. Christ is a title. And in the way we look at it in Unity, it's this perfect pattern of being, of our spiritual nature that it is in all of us. And our goal is to actualize it, to really embody it in full potential. And so this season is about looking at these qualities and how we can bring greater awareness, because it's not necessarily that we're giving birth to the Christ in our life. We're giving birth to the awareness of it, and to a deeper and deeper expression of it is a way to look at it, perhaps. Charles Fillmore, who was the co-founder of Unity, when he talked about Christmas, he said, "Each of us has within him the Christ, or her, just as Jesus had. And we must look within to recognize and actualize our sonship, or our divine origin and birth, even as Jesus did." If you look at Scripture, the Apostle Paul, writing in Galatians, was writing to a community of people that he was seeking to encourage. He kept telling them to remember, don't lose sight of the good news. And he said, I'm like a mother with birth pains, wanting and holding this for you. He said, until Christ's life becomes visible in your lives. The exact words are, until Christ is formed in you. And so it's even in the Scriptures, if you look for it, this idea of the Christ presence being formed and being birthed in our life. I like what Meister Eckhart, the 13th century German mystic, said. He said, become aware of what is in you. Announce it, pronounce it, produce it, and give it birth. And then perhaps Carl Jung said it most succinctly, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That's what each and every one of us are doing. And so we can say in a sense that what Jesus did was to demonstrate the possibility, and that every soul is meant to achieve this Christ experience. He said, the things that I do, ye shall do, and even greater. And so this time of year is especially a time for us to focus on how are we making space in our own life for this. And today we look at this through the lens of gratitude and hope, both of these together. If you think about hope is really the basic ingredient for optimism, for trust, for faith. Because hope is the tendency to dwell on the highest and best possibility. Hope is positive and a potent spiritual practice with the power to pull us through difficult times. You know, I don't think there's anything perhaps more disappointing than to hear the words, "There's no hope." Because if you ever feel that way, there's no hope, you feel like there's no life, what's the point? And so keeping hope alive and really understanding what hope is in the midst of the most challenging times in our life can be very rewarding. So hope does ideally pull us through difficult times. Hope is typically referred to with light metaphors, such as there's a ray of hope, a glimmer of hope, a beam of hope, or hope is a break in the clouds, or like a light at the end of a tunnel. And it's a feeling of expectation, believing in the possibility. Hope can be learned with practice. And certain attitudes support hope, primarily the attitude of gratitude. Because both hope and gratitude have the capacity to turn our attention, to shift our focus, to change how and where we're focused. And those things are incredibly important when we learn the power. You see, it's helpful for us to learn the power of our own attention and shifting and directing our attention. If you think about it, your attention is like a spotlight. And whatever you have your attention on, you're illuminating in your life. You illuminate where your attention is. And so the Hawaiians used to say, energy flows where thought goes, that where your focus, where your attention is, you're energizing that. So both hope and gratitude have the capacity to help us return and shift to what is true, what is good, what is favorable. Not in the sense that we're sticking our head in the ground, but in a way to balance that no matter where we are, there is still hope and there is still the presence of gratitude. And that's what we're delving into today. If I go back to the scripture in 1 Thessalonians, it says, always rejoice, constantly pray, in everything give thanks. Now, I often hear this, I believe, quoted what I would believe is incorrectly. In everything give thanks. Preposition here is really important because it does not say for everything give thanks. You see, there's a huge difference. Because I don't believe that if we are a person of compassion, how can you possibly give thanks for violence, for poverty, for destruction? How can you possibly give thanks for acts of terrorism? We can't give thanks for those things if we're a person of compassion. So the difference is in everything give thanks. That even in the midst of these things, you see, to be compassionate, to have gratitude as part of your essence, it makes you vulnerably human. To let life in, to let it touch you, to feel the hurt, to feel the pain, to realize the tragedy of when things that are terrible happen. But in the midst of these things, to be grateful that I know that everybody in the world doesn't show up like this. I know there's a higher way. I know there's a better way. I know that the presence of God is available no matter what. The presence of God can always show up. How? As you show up. As you show up, you bring that presence, you bring that light, you bring that illumination. And so it's not to give thanks for, but to give thanks in everything. And it makes a huge difference in our life when we begin to do that. Michael Beckwith, the founder of Agape, he was in the movie The Secret, and he's Oprah's personal spiritual coach. So he's pretty evolved spiritual being. Michael was just at the Parliament of World Religions, and I was talking to Michael, and he said, you know, I use the nightly news as a prayer list. I thought, that's great, that it's not about putting your head in the ground. He said, I want to be informed, but to me, it's a prayer list. It's what I'm praying about and where I'm focusing and giving gratitude in my life. Maya Angelou, speaking of gratitude, said it beautifully. She said, let gratitude be the pillow upon which you kneel to say your nightly prayer. Isn't that beautiful? Carol Lewis, who is the national director of First Place for Health, it's an international health company. Carol Lewis had a wonderful life, a great job, a wonderful family. She's one of those people that she was a devout Christian. She dedicated her life to that, and things had always gone well for her. That is until Thanksgiving in 2001. Carol had 3 daughters. Her middle daughter had 3 young children. On Thanksgiving Day 2001, Carol's daughter was killed by a drunk driver. And Carol said that overnight, her world changed. All of a sudden, she's now questioning God, questioning her faith. She was angry, she was bitter, devastated, hurting, sad and empty, broken. Her heart was broken and basically inconsolable. They were focused on finding the drunk driver and taking them to court and making sure that person got what was coming to them, so to speak. And what she realized that in the midst of all of this, her life was even being further torn apart. That more rage, more anger, more bitterness was seeping in, and she had never had to deal with that in her life. And she said, as she tried to pray, she kept being directed to that scripture, in all things give thanks. And it didn't make sense to her until she realized the difference. It wasn't saying for all things, but it was saying, Carol, in all things, you have to find a way to connect and to be able, what are you grateful for? And it was at that point she truly began to grieve, because she began to be thankful for the years she did have with her daughter. She began to be thankful for the grandchildren that she had. She began to be thankful that there are rules against drunk driving and things, just so many things, anything that she could think of to be thankful. And she realized that her broken heart had the capacity to become a heart of gratitude if she set that intention. She went on to write a book. Her book is titled A Thankful Heart: How Gratitude Brings Hope and Healing to Your Life. She helps many people now deal with tragedy and find gratitude in their life. But in her book, there's one line that really spoke to me, and the line is, when I do not practice developing a grateful heart, I am the one who hurts the most. Isn't that so true? That practicing gratitude, first and foremost, is to keep our own self tender and gentle and compassionate and spiritually human. It's to be connected and to realize that even at its best, life is precious and it is short. And we will all lose people. We will all eventually die ourselves. But to be able to balance those two worlds, the impermanence of life with the permanent truth, the truth that our spirit is bigger than birth or death, and that the qualities of our spirit can inform us and fill us in such a way that while we are living, we can give thanks in the midst of everything. As I began to think about this, I thought, I believe there are levels of gratitude, that it's really important to cultivate gratitude and hope in our life. And sometimes we may find ourselves in a state of no gratitude. Have you ever had a day where you felt like there was just no gratitude? Hopefully it didn't last long, because if you stay in the place of no gratitude, you're going to be depressed pretty quickly. And there's no quality of life at all in the no gratitude. The step up, I believe, is called fragments of gratitude. Those days when at the end we say, well, I guess it could have been worse. That's about all the gratitude we can muster is, at least I got home today, that it could have been worse. But from there, and a lot of people live in that place, that trying to have gratitude, it's based on what didn't go wrong. But there's another step, and that's called evidential gratitude. It's what we talk about when we say to count your blessings, that to look around and look at the many things in your life. We make gratitude lists of the things that we can see and remember and give thanks for. This year at Thanksgiving, just as we finished Thanksgiving lunch, my sister said, let's go around the table and everyone share something you're thankful for except family and health. Well, that's what we were all going to say, so we had to sit there a minute and go deeper. And as we finished, my sister said, think about this. What if, when you woke up today, the only things you had in your life were the things that you gave thanks for yesterday? Wow. Now, incidentally, when I was driving to church, I passed the Baptist church on Mount Gilead Road, and they have a sign, and that sign says, what if today, when you woke up, the only things you have in your life are the things you gave thanks for yesterday? I thought, that is surreal. There's a message. How many of you, if that were the case, would be here naked? I didn't give thanks for my clothes. How many of you would not have had a shower today? I didn't give, How many of you would have had to walk? It's like so many things that we forget to be thankful for. And we tend to take those for granted. And so bringing awareness to, when am I just having no gratitude? When is my gratitude just sort of pitiful? It's like, well, at least I didn't die today. Or the gratitude list. But then the final step is called a presence of gratitude. You see, it is to become the embodiment of one who is grateful. And that no matter where you go, when you show up, gratitude is there. Have you ever met a person that genuinely was grateful for life? How many of you have been through a life-threatening situation? When you came out on the other side, how was your gratitude barometer? It's definitely higher. If it's not higher, then you are becoming more and more hardened, more and more bitter, because it either goes one way or the other. And so our goal is to become softer. You see, it truly makes us more human when we allow gratitude to come in and to take over. Gratitude truly can shift us and shape us. Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, talked about gratitude, and he talked about what he called the formative power of mind. He truly believed that if we used our mind to focus on God the good and the good in our life, that it increased our capacity to bring in more good, to be a channel for more good. Well, science is now saying the same thing. The study of neuroscience is telling us that the brain really does change shapes depending on what you're talking about. There's a book that came out in 2011, Buddha's Brain. Did any of you read that book? It's a fabulous book, Buddha's Brain, The Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom. And Dr. Rick Hansen, he's a PhD, wrote the book. He's a neuropsychologist. He's a senior fellow at Berkeley, and he's meditated for many, many years. Combining all these things with his research and his team of researchers, they really discovered some powerful things about the brain. In studying the brain, there was one study he referenced where in London, they tracked taxi cab drivers, people that wanted to be a taxi cab driver in London, and they scanned their brains before they went through the training. After the several weeks of training, those that passed, they scanned the brains again and compared their brains, how it was before and after. And the part of the brain, I can't pronounce it, but the part of the brain that deals with how we look at grids and information, roads and things like that, that part of their brain had literally thickened. It had developed synapses and was literally thicker in those slides. They also, and they did many different studies, but another study had to do with long-term meditators like Buddhist monks. They've compared their brains to people that don't meditate. Those that meditate on a regular basis have a much more dense and connected synaptic system in the frontal portion of the brain, which is where we have the capacity to focus, to be present, to pay attention. And so they knew that we have the capacity to literally grow our brain. There's so many things, Sudoku and things like that, so many games that are popular now because they know that we need to exercise our brain and we can literally grow our brain. Well, they took it a step further. And this is an excerpt from his book. He said, Jesus, Moses, and the Buddha and other great teachers were all born with a brain built essentially like everyone else's. But then they used their minds to change their brains in ways that changed history. Scientists have discovered that your brain has a built-in negativity bias. In other words, as we evolved over millions of years, dodging sticks or threats and chasing carrots or food, it was a lot more important to notice, react to, and remember sticks than it was carrots. That's because in the tough environment in which our ancestors lived, if they missed out on a carrot or a meal, they could usually find another one and make it up. But if they failed to avoid a stick, a predator, a natural hazard, or aggression from another, wham, no more chances to pass on their genes. The negativity bias shows up in a lot of ways. You see, we are wired as part of our survival as a species. We're wired to gravitate away from pain, and therefore we pay attention to pain. Things that could hurt us, could kill us, could harm us, we are acutely aware of those things, more so than the things that may bring about pleasure. He said, the negativity bias today still shows up in a lot of ways. Typically in a relationship, for example, it takes 5 good interactions to make up for a single one. If you're in a relationship, say amen. It takes at least 5 good interactions to make up for a bad one. We all know that. If you're in a relationship, we hang on to those things. People will work much harder to avoid the negative feeling of losing $100 than they will for the positive feeling of gaining $100. Painful experiences are much more memorable and impactful than pleasurable ones. Think about this. In your own mind, what do you usually think about at the end of the day? The 50 things that went right or the one thing that went wrong? What do you usually think about? I learned that in my first ministry when I had only been in ministry about 3 or 4 months, I guess, and everyone would go out on Sunday and shake my hand, and they'd say, that was wonderful, I loved that, I enjoyed that. And then one Sunday, that was the case, and then one woman went through. And she shook my hand and she said, that was the most pitiful excuse for a sermon I've ever heard. And you know what my first thought was? I knew it. The rest of them are lying to me. They're just being nice. And I thank God I had the wherewithal to be present, to say, tell me more. And as she began to talk, what I discovered was her family, she had just lost her driver's license. Her family took them away. They dropped her off at church and said, go in there, you'll enjoy this. Then I felt a little bit better. But it really struck me that to this day, I can remember how I felt. But you know how many hundreds of people have said, oh my God, that was exactly what I needed. Why is that? You see, that's the case with all of it. And when I read this book, I thought, that's it. There's something in us that gravitates toward that. And I think there's a lot of reasons. He said, in effect, the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. He said, the good news is, however, just like Jesus and the Buddha and others, we can learn to use our mind to reshape our brain. We can learn how to recondition and build up other parts of our awareness so that we're not so affected. We're not so affected by those natural negatives that will always come our way. We can bring better balance in our lives. The way we do it, he said, is very simply and yet profoundly, it is to take in the good. Take in the good. Now, what he means by taking in the good is that when something positive happens, to pause for a moment and to really let it touch you, to let it make a memory, to let it get to you. It has to become a whole body experience, to try to feel it, to know it, believe it. And that throughout the day, as we set our intention to take in the good, what begins to happen is we are creating a greater capacity to be present to good. It's not at the expense of not paying attention to the facts at hand of what's going on, but it means that no matter what's going on, I am connected to the good. And so how do we do this? One of the ways I believe, would you give me the slide? This quote comes from Ernest Holmes. He was a contemporary of Charles Fillmore. He's the founder of Science of Mind, today's Centers for Spiritual Living. I actually put this on some little slips of paper, and they're in a basket by the bookstore because I knew you may want one. I want to read this. I live in the faith that there is a presence and power greater than I am that nurtures and supports me in ways I could not even imagine. I know that this presence is all-knowing and all-power and is always right where I am. You see, Einstein said there's two ways to look at the world. That is, as if everything is a miracle or nothing is. I believe this. And when I take in the good, first and foremost, when I take in the good, the truth of my being and how I'm connected to all that is, that sets me, it relaxes me, and it allows me to be present for the day, to take in the good around me. And so the next step then is to actively take in the good. So often we take things for granted. Just like I said, what if when you woke up today, the only things you had are the things that you noticed or were grateful for yesterday? Make it a practice to give thanks for those things. In my last ministry in the Seattle area, we had the pleasure of hosting the Asante African Children's Choir. Have many of you ever experienced an African choir? It is incredible. It's groups that they train children from Africa, songs in English, some in African. They go on a tour to raise money to take back to their communities and their facilities. And so the Asante Children Choir was just starting their tour, and they were coming through Seattle, so we had them at our place. It was so humbling and touching because the children were there early, and as the minister, I got to be there and interact with them, and their faces, their presence, it was like pure love. And a lot of these children came from conditions that were horrible. Many of their parents had died of AIDS. Many of them had no family at all. And yet they were the most happy little children I had ever seen. Just as they finished the rehearsal and were getting ready to go on stage, I went backstage and I opened up the bathroom door. And there was a little boy standing there at the sink with his hands in the water, kind of going in and out. And as soon as I opened the door and saw someone, I closed it. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then I waited and I waited. I thought, he's just in there playing. And so I knocked again and opened the door, and sure enough, he was still standing at the water, just putting his hand, just looking at me, smiling. And I helped him dry his hands and got him and took him on to the choir, put him back with the group. I didn't think anything about him until that night. That night when I was in my bed and I was doing my reviewing the day and my gratitude list, all of a sudden I saw that little boy again, and I got a pang in my heart. I noticed it in a way I didn't notice it in the moment. You see, that little boy had come from a village where there was no running water. And this was one of the first stops in the United States. And for him, standing there with running water, putting his hands under it back and forth, that was nothing short of miraculous. And it just touched me deeply. I made a commitment to myself that night. I said, I will never look at water the same. And as a matter of fact, I will use water as a gratitude practice. How many times do we put our hands in water throughout the day? And how many times do we take a shower and our mind is ahead of thinking about what we got to do that day or what we just did that day? But if you really allow it and give thanks for the warm water, for bathrooms, for inside toilets, the many ways we use water, that in and of itself is enough to cultivate gratitude in our lives. And I think that that's what we're all here to do, and that's how we take in the good. Don't take it for granted. Richard, would you get ready? But not yet, but just get ready. What dawned on me, this is not in the book, but what really hit me is that when he says take in the good, it's to reach a level where you take in the good. You take it in with you wherever you go. You carry it in with you. You see, when we become the cause. We're no longer being thrown around by the effects of life, but we're part of the cause. And we're aligning ourselves in that wherever I go, gratitude is there. It's sort of like if you came up on an accident and someone needed help, and all of a sudden here comes a little doctor with a black bag running up. Everyone would be so grateful because they knew that person carried knowledge and they had tools. They had something that could help. Well, what if we really recognize that we have the capacity to carry within us things that our world needs right now? We, each and every one, not only have the capacity, but have the responsibility to cultivate these qualities so that wherever we go, we're bringing them. We carry it with us. Take it. I take in the good. The final story I want to share with you about gratitude and taking in the good is a true story. It takes place in 1938 with a man by the name of Bob May. In 1930s, of course, was a time of the Depression, but Bob had been fortunate enough to go to college. He was living in Chicago. He had a job at Montgomery Ward. How many of you remember the department store Montgomery Ward? Well, he had a job at Montgomery Ward as a copywriter. And he had a wife and a daughter who was 4 years old, but his wife had been battling cancer. It had exhausted their savings, everything they had, and just a couple of weeks before Christmas in 1938, his wife, Evelyn, died. Left Bob in incredible debt and with a 4-year-old daughter. He had to move into a 2-room apartment in the slums of Chicago. But what Bob May had, he carried with him a spirit of gratitude. He certainly was grieving for good reasons, many things. He was certainly worried and concerned for good reason about many things. But he also knew that he was connected to a higher power and that the spirit of gratitude and hope would never leave him or forsake him if he remained open to it. And he wanted his daughter to know that. And so he made up this imaginary character about this kind of misfit, which was sort of like Bob. He felt like he never fit in, but he knew he had a good role and a good purpose and could do good things. And he would tell his daughter this story, and that year at Christmas in 1938, he had no money to buy her a gift, so he turned his story into a storybook, and he gave it to her. Well, Montgomery Ward heard about the book, and the next year, they paid him a nominal fee for the book. They bought it, and they started making copies, and they gave to the children who came into their store at Christmas beginning in 1939. It helped Bob a lot because they paid him money for that. By 1946, Montgomery Ward had distributed over 6 million copies of his little storybook. And that same year, a publisher discovered the book and wanted it. They wanted the rights. So in an unprecedented gesture of kindness and gratitude, the CEO of Montgomery Ward returned all the rights back to Bob May and allowed him to sell it to the publisher, and he then made a lot of money. He by then had remarried, had several children, and it changed his whole life. Well, the story doesn't end there. Bob had a brother-in-law named Johnny Marks. Johnny Marks had read this book and loved it and wrote a song about it. And the song he went to Bing Crosby and asked Bing Crosby to record it, and Bing Crosby said no. Then he went to Dinah Shore, who was also popular at the time, and asked her to record it, and she said no. Well, then he went to the singing cowboy, Gene Autry. And Gene Autry said, "I'll sing Rudolph Had the Red-Nosed Reindeer." Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I love that true story about Bob May because to me, it shows that when you stay centered in hope and in gratitude, and from that place, give what you can give authentically. That's what he did, and it blessed many lives and many children and came back. And you'll hear that this season, and I hope when you do, it'll take you into a place of gratitude. And so this season, as we begin to enter into what we call the Christmas season, I invite each of you to realize that I take in the good. I set my intention to take in and pay attention to the good that is happening all around me. And I set my intention and realize that I take in the good. I have the capacity to speak up at times. I have the capacity to hold sacred space. I take in the good. And so the song we've chosen to take us into a time of meditation says, I breathe in and I breathe out. I breathe in, I breathe out, I take in, I give up.